This week on The Wheelhouse. Unaccompanied children. What happens when child migrants are picked up at the U.S. border? And what do their attorneys say about the resettlement process? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Children as young as 5 years old are being resettled in Connecticut after being picked up by federal law enforcement at the U.S. border. Attorneys for these unaccompanied children say they're being held for too long and in some cases aren't released to sponsors at all until legal action is taken. This hour, we examine the U.S. government's obligation to unaccompanied children. Later in the show, with early in-person voting starting next week for the August 11th primaries, we'll get a primer on where the candidates stand. And we'll learn about a new federal program designed to support Connecticut's efforts in the fight for affordable housing. But first, we start with Sabrina Tavi. She's a senior attorney and the director of the Center for Children's Advocacy. Sabrina and her colleagues represent the children picked up by federal law enforcement and resettled in states like Connecticut. Sabrina, thank you for joining us on The Wheelhouse.
Hi, Frankie. Thanks so much for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Tess Regan is managing attorney for Kids in Need of Defense, otherwise known as KIND. Tess and Sabrina have worked together on behalf of the unaccompanied children. Tess, welcome to The Wheelhouse.
Good morning, Frankie. Thanks for having me.
And then Jackie Rabe Thomas, she brought the story to us. Jackie's an investigative reporter with Hearst, Connecticut CT Insider. Jackie, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
As you hear what life is like for children resettled in Connecticut, I want to know what your thoughts are on the state of immigration in the United States. Hit us up, comment on our YouTube live stream, or give us a call, 888-720-9677. Sabrina, how many children have you represented who are designated, I guess, as unaccompanied? And how would they find themselves in Connecticut?
Thanks, Frankie. Well, the Center for Children's Advocacy, along with our co-counsel at the law firm of Koskoff and Beater, we've co-counseled to represent 4 children who have been detained in government custody in Connecticut. And we represented them in filing lawsuits in federal court to force the government to release them after the government has been failing to process their sponsors' applications to have them timely released. And the filing of all of those lawsuits, unfortunately, has been necessary to force the government to do what they're required to do by law and to treat these children humanely. And as soon as we've filed those cases, the result has been that the government has, in our particular cases, released the children immediately.
Tess, what about you and your organization? What does it do? It's called Kids in Need of Defense, also known as KIND. How do you find these children and get involved, I guess?
Sure. Thanks, Frankie. So KIND is a global nonprofit that is dedicated to protecting the rights of unaccompanied children and refugee and separated children. How we get involved in these cases is, perhaps I should explain how the children end up in these detention programs.
Yes, please.
To start with, but essentially, children come to the border by themselves or with someone else who is not their parent or legal guardian. If they're under 18 and not with a parent or legal guardian, they're designated as an unaccompanied child. And by law, Border Patrol has to transfer them into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, which we call ORR, then looks for someone called a sponsor for this child. It's typically a family member who is willing to provide for the child's physical and mental well-being. And they engage in the sponsorship process to vet that sponsor, make sure it's a safe place for the child to go live, while they go through their removal or deportation proceedings in immigration court. And so how Kind interacts with them is we are the designated legal service provider for several of the shelters here in Connecticut where these children are held while they go through the sponsorship process.
One thing I really want to spell out here, and I want to help us get through this and maybe define it. Would you say, Sabrina Tess, would you say that at any point in this legally the children are detained?
Yes, we would describe it as federal detention.
And
in that the children's liberty is restricted, they're held in facilities in a variety of settings. There's sort of a range of restrictiveness as to the programs that they're held in, which can be anywhere from, staff secure, one-to-one supervision, a residential treatment facility, a shelter level facility where the children reside 24/7 in a building where they receive their educational programming, sleep, eat their meals, cannot leave without staff supervision, to, a less restrictive setting like a transitional foster care program or a long-term foster care program for children that are going to be held for very long periods of time.
I say that because I could imagine that could be a touch point with the office, and I want to make sure that we did try to reach out to these folks to see what they had to say about it. We reached out to federal officials with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Public Affairs for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, that's sort of who this is under the purview of, sent a written statement through email saying, quote, "The Administration for Children and Families does not comment on matters subject to ongoing litigation." So that's all we got in that regard. And now I follow with Jackie. Your recent reporting followed the lives of some of these children who are held in Connecticut. What were you told by the office?
Also, that they don't comment on individual cases, but we also ask them for, do you see this as a problem that children are being held for so long? We had a 5-year-old that we focused on who was held for 118 days, and a 12-year-old who was held 505 days, a 15-year-old held 255 days away from their family, alone, and they wanted to answer that question, they being the White House, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and Health and Human Services, asking them, do you see these long stays as something reasonable or something that you're working on to speed up? And they wanted to answer that question.
And that's something I want to key in on. I want to talk about the children in Connecticut that are going through this, or at least roughly some kind of number. But 515, I think, was one you said?
505 days.
505 days, 215. Is there a certain time frame that this should get done in, Sabrina, Tess?
I'll take that. Yes, ORR has internal policy and also federal regulations, as well as there is federal case law and federal statutes on what the process is supposed to look like. For example, ORR has 10 days to adjudicate a complete sponsorship application when the sponsor is the child's parent or legal guardian. So, they also have other rules of, if they're going to order a home study to have the sponsor's home evaluated, it should happen within a certain period of time. If they're going to ask for DNA testing, it has to happen within a certain period of time. And I'll pass to Sabrina to comment on whether that is happening in these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely not happening in these cases. And what we're seeing is that the government is dragging its feet in terms of implementing these requirements for sponsors to comply with. Our families that we've worked with are more than willing to comply with the requirements that the government imposes, such as a DNA test or a home study. And for example, in the case of the 5-year-old, while the DNA test, if required by the government, should be conducted within a matter of 5 to 7 days, they didn't even order it in her case for 3 months for her mother. And To the question of detention, it's absolutely detention. These children aren't free to leave, and that's why it's taken these federal lawsuits to force the government's hand to release them. And in the case of, there have been many children in Connecticut for whom habeas cases have been filed in federal court, but in the cases that have been filed by the Center for Children's Advocacy and our co-counsel, Koskoff. What we have found is that as soon as we file these cases, the government, has released the children and have shown that they can act quickly when their hand is forced. And I just want to, our co-counsel at Koskoff, Chris Maddie, has commented that in all of his years of litigating on behalf of and against the federal government, he's never seen the government unwilling to defend its conduct. And I think that really speaks to the fact that it is indefensible conduct to be holding these children for such prolonged periods of time.
And you would generally say that these children are pretty much ready to go back into the hands of a loved one or a sponsor, whatever it is, around 30 days.
Are they willing to, did you say?
Ready at that point. So
Oh.
At that point, they should be reconnected is what you're saying at that point. It shouldn't be taking
Absolutely.
longer. So like they
Absolutely.
will have already set that up. Somebody will have set that up long enough in advance or through you all to where they should be ready to go by 30 days instead of, it's not them that are sort of struggling at this time to keep up with it. You're saying the government's dragging its feet.
That's correct, Frankie. The law requires that as soon as a child comes into the custody of ORR, that they're obligated to look for a sponsor to whom the child can be released because that is considered to be the least restrictive placement, and that's required by law. And before this administration, for example, in 2024, the process of vetting sponsors and releasing them was taking on average about 30 days in 2024. And now that average nationwide is 206 days. And as Jackie pointed out, we've seen that number, climb all the way up to 505 days for a young child here in Connecticut.
That's longer than a year. Jackie, dozens of kids, including a 5-year-old last spring when you're reporting on this?
Yeah, what we found was that we're talking about on any given day this past spring, there's just over 24 children, around 24 children in federal custody who are living in Connecticut. I should note that, there's a lot of numbers here, but the number of children who have actually been released so far this year, during the first 6 months of this year, there's only been 7 children released so far to sponsors here in Connecticut. In previous years, it's been about 1,000. So the number of children who are really being released, I can't overemphasize, is it seems to be that it's the cases where lawyers are filing lawsuits challenging detentions that they're calling illegal.
If they're going through normal protocol, though, so you're saying there should be more released than 7 probably, particularly if there were dozens.
Correct.
Yeah. I want to understand, Tess, what a normal day might look like for these children and kind of what they go through.
Yeah, I think it depends on what kind of facility the child is in. Like I said previously, there's a variety of different settings, but if you're talking about, for example, a transitional foster care program, like one of the ones we have here in Connecticut, that is for tender age children, meaning children under the age of 12. And those children would typically reside with a foster family at night and on the weekends and come to the facility first thing in the morning. They'd then have, breakfast and lunch at the facility, have their educational programming there, meet with a clinician and their case manager, and remain at the facility till about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, being picked up by their foster family. If it's one of the residential facilities, which we also have in Connecticut, the children would sleep at the facility and do all of their meals, all of their education at the facility. The days tend to look pretty similar day in and day out. The children are only allowed to leave with staff supervision, even just to step outside and get some fresh air or have a walk. The children have described it as extremely demoralizing, that they feel completely alone, that they have no freedom, that they've lost their spirit, sometimes lost themselves in this process.
What kind of facility is this? When you say facility and we're talking about somebody being there and maybe even boarding there, what does it look like in there? Does it look more like a child care setting or like a school or like a prison? What does it kind of look like?
So there are a variety of facilities all across the country. I will say in Connecticut, my experience has been positive with the facilities in the sense that these local staff that works there are very dedicated to child welfare and trying to make it a nice space for children, though they're not designed to hold children for really long periods of time. You know, they're designed for the kids to be there 2 or 3 weeks, not a year or 2 years. So, you know, for example, the facility might look like a house that has some rooms converted to an office and dormitory style bedroom with a dining area where they do their schooling and their meals. Um, you know, it might look more like
Like a law office or something like that.
yeah, it might look more like a kind of like a school, but maybe like a little bit more secure than a
Sure.
school, with kind of a classroom setup and a recreation area.
We're talking about legal intervention for these kids because it sounds like, from what Tess is saying there, that this is like supposed to be really temporary, but more than a year for some of these kids, or at least one of them in custody. So, are you finding that legal intervention is something that's getting these kids out? Maybe something in the 7 that have been released that you've seen?
Yeah, what we found was shortly after habeas case lawsuits challenging their detention, that children were almost immediately released shortly after. I should point out that all of this is happening in the context of sort of a broader immigration changes throughout the country. And so, you know, looking at just what's happening with this case with the administration will tell you that we just want to make sure that we're vetting children appropriately and their parents to make sure that we're releasing children to safe homes. And so I think what the advocates will tell you is, okay, do that and don't let that take a year.
Yeah.
But it's also hard to not sort of ignore what the context of this is happening. For these same children, ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, has also begun sharing parents' information that they give to ICE and DHS for deportation and arrest proceedings. The Trump administration has also actively been cutting legal aid for children who, so that they have representation for people like Tess, and to make sure that children who are in these facilities have someone who has eyes on them. The Trump administration is also expediting immigration proceedings, offering some of these children, you know, $2,700 to self-deport. We came across one of those cases. They've also tried to, you know, bypass due process in Guatemalan children, in deporting them through not having that. And then the New York Times reported recently that the Trump administration considered doing away with habeas cases for immigrants. So the very case that got these children out, the habeas lawsuits, the Trump administration was considering doing away with the ability to file those.
So then we got to talk about what happens when there's not legal intervention. And I would imagine there's child development concerns with these resettled youth. And Tess, when we're talking about somebody being there for a year, that's a year of, and being somewhere that might be temporary, that might be a year where they miss out on a whole year of school and development, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially given like the isolation of the children. You know, sometimes the children might be the only child in that facility or program, so they're not having the social interaction that they should have at that age. Which has serious impacts on their ability to form relationships and their development for the future. A recurring concern of ours is education for these children. What level of education are they getting? And, you know, these are group settings. So the children may be at a wide variety of educational levels and all getting the same instruction, which, you know, is just not appropriate for a child as their brain develops. We've seen children who are picked up as the result of interior enforcements by ICE and placed in these facilities. And those children were children who were enrolled in public school in the United States for years and are now going from their public school education to the educational programming in a facility like this.
And is anyone counseling these children, particularly when I saw in a situation that Jackie reported on that one of the children had seen a sponsor maybe for an hour at a time a day, whenever they could, and then they're crying and they're separated from that person. So, like, is anybody trying to, help that child along and cope with some of this trauma?
Well, I'll jump.
Yeah, I'll let Sabrina take that.
I'll jump in to say that, as Tess mentioned, the staff at these facilities, they're dedicated to child welfare, and they are trying to meet the needs of these kids. But the emotional and psychological toll of these prolonged detentions on these children really can't be overstated. And when we work with these kids and we go in to meet with them in these facilities, the trauma of this prolonged detention and separation from their families is profound. They use, in their own words, to describe how they feel trapped, desperate, lonely, anxious, and sad. I just want to really bring those words to a forefront because, their experience and the long-term effects of these detention on them is what we really need to, be thinking about, and the government should be thinking about when they are using these kids to affect, an intentional campaign, frankly, to discourage immigration. One of the kids who it was an internal illegal detention here in the U.S., who was here with deferred action, approved SIJ, social security number. He describes that in his own words, I've been here so long that I'm forgetting things about my life, like my friends' names, my teachers, all of the things that I wanted to do with my future. He was there for 6 months, almost 6 months. And those words are haunting.
It's a very powerful testimony. Thank you for sharing it, Sabrina. I'm going to finish up here with Jackie. You wrote a piece for CTinsider.com with the headline, 5 things that could help immigrant children detained in Connecticut. What are they?
I think number one is the federal government begin following its regulations, and there's a least restrictive requirement in the law that says children need to be close to their families, with their families when possible. And so the federal government should start following that and making sure that children have are reunited in a timely fashion like they historically have. And then the second thing I would say is making sure children have attorneys. Tomorrow, actually, there's supposed to be a deadline for when a federal contract is for attorneys for these children is going to be running out. And it's really unsure what happens to children.
I actually have to finish up there, but before I do, just really quickly, can you tell us how important that deadline is and why it matters, Sabrina or Tess?
I'll take this one, Frankie. Yes. So the only reason that organizations like KIND are able to meet with these children, give them Know Your Rights presentations, do legal intakes with them, represent them in their immigration cases is because of the funding we get through this federal contract. And that federal contract is coming to an end with no plan to replace it, which means these children will not have access to counsel. We're often the only people that have eyes on these children, that are seeing what they're going through, that are checking in on them as like an independent viewer and representing them in their proceedings because they are in deportation proceedings while all this is happening. And we don't know what will happen with the loss of this contract and the loss of this funding. It's devastating to organizations like ours. And we're very concerned about the future for these children.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You've been listening to Jackie Rabe Thomas, investigative reporter with Hearst Connecticut Insider, a CT Insider, Tess Regan, managing attorney for Kids in Need of Defense, and Sabrina Tavi, a senior attorney and director of the Center for Children's Advocacy. Thank you all for coming on the show and talking about this important topic.
Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you all. After the break, there's bipartisan legislation to address a national dearth of affordable housing. We'll tell you how it made it through a divided Congress. What's your housing situation? How might state and federal officials help? Hit us up. You're listening to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Earlier this summer, federal lawmakers, including Connecticut's delegation to the U.S. Congress, struck a broad bipartisan deal on legislation they say will boost affordable housing construction in America. The federal 21st Century Road to Housing Act became a law on July 11th without having been signed by President Trump. What does that mean for legislation? What are our representatives in Washington, D.C. saying about the affordable housing deal? Well, reporting live from the D.C. area is Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and the CT Mirror. Good friend of mine. Thank you so much for being here, Lisa.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So good to have you here. I want to know what folks' situation is with their living situation. I want to know if they're having an affordable housing crisis. Let us know. Hit us up, comment on our YouTube live stream, or give us a call, 888-720-9677. Let's begin with the basics, Lisa. What exactly is the 21st Century Road to Housing Act?
It's a pretty wide-ranging, sweeping bill, and that's because Congress has not done much on housing legislation in a number of decades. And so I'll try to gloss through it quickly because there's so much to it. But it boosts housing construction, especially at a time when supply is low and prices are still high in Connecticut and across the country. What I think the crux of it really is sends federal funding in the forms of different grants and incentives to state and local governments and really empower them to try to solve their own, housing crises and really tailor it best to their communities. It tackles homelessness. It tries to boost and build more affordable housing. So it's really kind of a catch-all. And, I think the point I'll keep making is that there's only so much the federal government can do on this issue. And it really comes down to what states and, localities can do. But I think it really empowers them.
So much they can do as well, only so much they could do as well in terms of passing legislation. You reported that this proposal was, quote, one of the rare pieces of bipartisan legislation that got through a divided Congress ahead of the midterm elections. So I guess this bill is sort of an exception right now in a divided Congress.
Definitely. I mean, I think the majority of bills you see that are these, getting through a divided Congress are these must-pass bills or bills that are really pretty non-controversial. They garner, near unanimous support. And so the biggest things to really get through Congress a lot of the time are government funding. And obviously that didn't work out for a lot of last year and this year with a few shutdowns, big defense policy bills. And so to see something this big and major on an issue that, is important to both parties and get through in a midterm election year. I mean, that can't be overstated enough to pass major legislation when people are actively campaigning in an issue like affordability being such a big deal and housing playing into that. That's major, especially for a divided Congress like we currently have.
Yeah, I guess the only positive you could say about the federal government shutdown is that two friends that are separated hundreds of miles like you and I get to see each other more as we try to talk through and parse through this kind of thing. This bill passed the House in the winter, according to your reporting, but didn't become law until July. What was the holdup?
It was stalled for a number of months, and it was really because the House and Senate were just passing different versions. Nothing, I would say, super major, but, there was different parties asking for different concessions, even things that were pretty unrelated to housing. And so, and what was interesting is that, we talked about how it didn't ultimately get President Trump's signature. He did play a role in this. I mean, this was something that he did support, and he kind of went back and forth, and he endorsed the Senate version, then he endorsed the House version. And so, we just kind of saw months of this stalling out and multiple votes on this. And so, by the summer, about a month ago, Congress came together on a compromise negotiation, a compromise bill, and they passed this. And eventually became law without a signature.
But that's where I want to get to. Before we get into the nuance of the provision that President Trump and other lawmakers might have been a little hesitant on, there's also a political ploy that Donald Trump employed, I understand.
Yes, he has in other different legislative capacities. He has been trying to push the Save America Act, which is the Republicans' big election reform bill. It would change the way voters register. It would change voter ID laws. And so this is something, speaking of legislation stalling, that has stalled in Congress. It's passed the House. It will not be able to make it out of the Senate. Republican leadership has been vocal and public on that. And so because the Save America Act has gone nowhere and will probably go nowhere in Congress, President Trump said, "Hey, I'm not signing this housing bill until we do something on the Save America Act." And so that's what he did. He did not offer his signature. Basically, when legislation passes both chambers of Congress, the president has 10 days to sign this, and as long as Congress does not adjourn, it becomes law automatically. And that's what we saw in this bill. It did not earn Trump's signature at the end of the day, despite his endorsement, but it became law.
We did a whole show on the Save America Act, including talking to Rosa DeLauro in that program. So go back to the archives at ctpublic.org/wheelhouse to learn more about that. Thank you for getting into that. Let's get into maybe a provision that people were really talking about. My concern is you're worried about, not you personally, Lisa, but lawmakers are worried about either private equity firms or private landlords, I guess, gobbling up real estate and maybe trying to turn a profit instead of at least trying to make sure that people are in an affordable kind of situation that is an actually nice place to live?
Yeah, I would say that is one of the provisions that got the most attention in this bill. And again, it was something that President Trump had been pushing for on his own. He'd actually done an executive order exactly on provision like this. And so what ultimately got through in the final bill was that it placed a ban on large institutional investors with 350 units or more from purchasing additional single family homes with some exceptions. And so what ended up looking different is it did get watered down a bit. There was a different version originally that would have required those same investors to sell off single family homes that were going to be rented out after a certain amount of time, basically this build to rent housing. And so I think there were some concerns in that, I think people want to see more housing options, not just single family homes. They want to be able to see rental housing. And so I think that's where some fears were in that. But this provision takes aim at more Wall Street, private equity getting involved in this and potentially pricing out individuals and families from wanting to buy single family homes. And so that was really the crux of that provision that made it into the final bill.
Tell me about how Connecticut's delegation voted on it, or at least how somebody might, like a Jim Himes or a Chris Murphy might have figured into this whole conversation.
They all ultimately supported it. They, again, as I said, it's gone through multiple revisions, so everyone in the delegation had supported it at one point or another. The only thing was that Congresswoman Jahana Hayes was at her son's graduation. She couldn't vote on the final version of the bill, but said she would have supported it. But ultimately, all 7 members of the delegation have supported it. I think I mentioned when I was talking about the institutional investors in the original version, when it was more stringent, Senator Murphy had some concerns on it. And he basically just said he didn't want unintended consequences of potentially, taking out some of the different types of housing for Connecticut residents, like a rental home, a build to rent kind of situation. And then you mentioned Congressman Himes. He was able to get 2 of his own provisions and bills, again, because this is a massive, massive bill. So there was multiple pieces of legislation that was put in this package. And so he was able to get 2 of his own provisions into the bill. And he acknowledged that they were small, and some of it was just incentivizing different towns to be able to use some of their block grant funding to go towards constructing more housing, and that would apply to some of his districts and towns in his district. And so, so they, the Connecticut delegation played a role, but ultimately fully supportive of the legislation.
And finally, quickly, what are they saying about if it'll work, if at all, or how it'll actually work?
I think one thing they'll caution, and I think I've seen too, is that this is not going to be an overnight thing. I think we realize that building housing and this is a tough issue, and this will take time. And so I don't think anyone is oblivious to the fact that this is not going to be an overnight thing. We will not blink an eye and see hundreds and hundreds of new units, but advocates and people who support it say it's a step in the right direction.
But the boilerplate version, or excuse me, the way to break this down briefly is to probably say that as a result of this legislation, some municipalities will be able to apply for some CBDGs, like some community development block grants or something like that. That's the best way to see how this will work.
Yeah, and it's a point I made earlier. I think these are lots of different pots of funding, channels of money that will be funneled from the federal government to states and localities, and they will apply it in the best way they see fit to their communities. Every community needs different types of housing. They have their own sets of issues. And so again, this is, at the end of the day, housing is a state and local issue. And so I think the government and Congress is hoping that these federal grants and this federal money will ultimately help their towns and their districts and states.
Lisa Hagen, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and the Connecticut Mirror. She isn't going anywhere. She's going to stick around for our final segment. Questions on what you heard so far, give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Coming up after the break, the August 11th primary elections, what races to watch for and which one you'll see play out on an upcoming edition of The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We've explored a couple different topics today. What life is like for young undocumented migrants who've been resettled in Connecticut, and new federal affordable housing legislation. We're going to pivot to primary season now. And as we do that, I want to let you know about something big we got happening here next week. It's about the race for the 1st Congressional District, the Hartford-based seat in Congress. Each candidate running for the Democratic Party primary, including incumbent John Larson, will be featured on next week's show. Hear from the incumbent, as well as challengers Ruth Fortune, Jillian Gilchrist, and Luke Bronin. He's the party-endorsed candidate. On the next Wheelhouse, let's talk a little bit about this and election season. We still have Lisa Hagen with us, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and the CT Mirror. And joining us now in studio for this conversation, couldn't do it without Mark Pasniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief and co-founder of the Connecticut Mirror. Welcome back to the Wheelhouse.
Glad to be here.
Glad to be here. Glad to be talking to you about the primary. And I do want to follow up on housing because we were just talking about it with Lisa. Is this affordable housing issue coming up on the campaign trail? I mean, I imagine it is, but how can we talk about how you're hearing about it?
On the congressional one, I would say no. I mean, I think all the Democrats agreed with that bill. The issue there was, would the president allow it to go forward? And in the gubernatorial race, a little bit, but again, it's in the congressional. The issue has really been a call for generational change, which is a factor in a couple of the other down ballot primaries this year.
Maybe if we were talking about this in some kind of insider way, maybe we would look at that as an opportunity for Josh Elliott to either make hay in the gubernatorial race, or maybe miss an opportunity or something like that. Should affordable housing maybe be more of that purview? I was watching the debate. I think Mark Pasniokis covered it. I caught it on delay here and watched it with WTNH. But help us understand that debate. They did talk about affordable housing maybe for a couple of seconds there. There was a big veto that the governor was involved in.
There was. His veto of the original housing bill was one of the major sources of friction between Governor Lamont and more progressive elements of the General Assembly. The other one was his veto of a bill that would have provided jobless benefits for striking workers. But the governor, when he vetoed it, he said he is open and, in fact, wants to see another version, but he wanted to see greater buy-in from municipal officials. And in fact, that's what they did. They negotiated a new version. He kept his word on that. He called them back in special session, and indeed they passed that bill, which, even though there were some compromises made that were sought by municipal officials, it still did not get a single Republican vote in the General Assembly. So it's still very much a wedge issue in general elections, not as much in the primary.
In watching the debate and understanding the candidates' visions for the future, Governor Lamont talks about continued economic growth. Can residents count on this, I guess, like private investment or surpluses to fund the budget? Can they continue to count on that if that's what he's talking about? And then what about Elliott's proposed 4% income tax surcharge that we hear that seems to be something he thinks will generate a lot of revenue for the state in the future and solve a lot of these issues that people are talking about? It seems like they're all lumped into sort of one thing.
What started out as a 1% surtax on the richest taxpayers in Connecticut, that was something floated and pushed by Senate President Pro Tem Martin Looney. When Massachusetts, in a referendum, passed a 4% surtax on incomes basically above $1 million, that is something that Representative Elliott embraced. And, he has noted that that tax has actually produced more than was originally projected, which he says is evidence that the richest will not flee a state over taxes, and that it's something Connecticut should look at. The governor, his position has been it is not necessary, that Connecticut currently has adequate revenue levels. In fact, he has had an unprecedented string of surpluses in Connecticut, 7 surpluses. And, Ned Lamont's political brand has been fiscal discipline and sustainable programs after decades and decades of varying degrees of mismanagement, largely due to the state's complete failure to adequately fund pension system for state employees, which led to one of the highest unfunded pension liabilities in the United States. And that threatened to become a crippling burden on the state budget. It was more and more each year was required to deal with the pensions. Under Governor Lamont, they've used certain surplus funds to pay down that debt, and it has impacts in the current year budgets because you don't have to put as much money out to keep the pensions viable.
What's the significance of this primary election?
For governor, it is a test. I mean, every primary is a test to a degree of what is the current identity of a political party, right? You see that in New York City, clearly in those congressional primaries. The Democratic Socialists have shown that they have real power in certain parts of the city of New York. The question here is, what is the appetite to push Governor Lamont to the left or to replace him with a 41-year-old, 10-year state rep whose campaign began sort of as a protest or an issues-based campaign to kind of nudge the governor to the left. And then it morphed into something else when it became clear that A, he was going to qualify for the primary quite easily at the convention, and B, qualify for public financing. He's got a $3.75 million public grant. Came a little bit late in the game. It might have been a different race if he qualified earlier. But right now, you have somebody who does have certain backing within the party, and he's got the money to deliver his message. So it will be a test to a degree of, again, what is the appetite for change? Governor Lamont is clearly a social progressive on a conventional shopping list of things. He supported the $15 minimum wage and the indexing and a whole bunch of other labor things other than the strikers' benefits. But yes, he is a fiscal centrist, or by Connecticut Democratic standards, perhaps a fiscal conservative, kind of a Charlie Baker, a Democratic version of Charlie Baker in Massachusetts.
First primary that Governor Lamont has faced since he ran in 2018, the first time when he went against Joe Ganim, and the first one in 40 years for a sitting governor?
No, the first one in 48 years.
48 years, yeah.
It was the sainted Ella Grasso, believe it or not, whose lieutenant governor turned on her and challenged her in 1978. So this is the first primary challenge to a sitting governor in a long, long time.
Won't be covering that on election night. I mean, imagine you'll be paying attention to it and writing about it, but you'll be physically with the first congressional race, as I understand it, and so will Lisa.
No, I'll be at the governor's.
Lisa, you'll be at the governor's. I'm sorry about that. I had that wrong.
Yes,
you'll be with the governor's. Are you going to be with Elliott or Lamont? Do you know yet? Both.
We're going to staff both. I'll probably be at the governor's headquarters.
All right, CT Mirror is going to have it all. CTmirror.org. We got that. CTpublic.org as well. Lisa, you're covering the first congressional district. How's that going for the incumbent?
Yeah, and it, kind of in the same vein that Mark was just talking about the governor's race. I mean, it's that same kind of strains happening, but I would say at least when you're looking at the challengers, and especially someone like former Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, it feels very much generational. And so, and you're talking about the governor's race. Josh Elliott is kind of running more of a ideological race as a challenger. In the first congressional district, it feels a bit different. And I think that was made clear at last night's debate on WTNH. It was the first time they all kind of came together for a televised debate. And, you had three different people, Luke Bronin, Jillian Gilchrist, Ruth Fortune, all make the case in different ways that there should be someone new. And much like the governor's race, we haven't seen many primaries of sitting incumbents in Congress. And this will be the first one for Congressman Larson in 28 years. And so, you have them pulling for generational change, and maybe in a different way than we've seen in other primaries, like Mark alluded to in New York City, and Congressman Larson defending his 28-year record in Congress and trying to make the case that he is, in fact, standing up to Donald Trump for the Democratic Party.
Lisa, this is a 14-term incumbent who says that he has the Ways and Means chair position coming to him. There's that, but he ain't endorsed in this race, and he doesn't have the most money in this race, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic. He's been in this seat since 1999. It's a really big deal for a sitting incumbent to not have the endorsement of the party. And, albeit Luke Bronin won it narrowly, he still managed to win it, and he is the party endorsed candidate. In terms of the money, it's, Luke Bronin does have a bit more money, but at the end of the day, it's that John Larson and Luke Bronin both have more than enough money to run ads on the airwaves. They've been dominating. It's the fact that Gilchrist and Fortune haven't been able to put up the same kind of money, thus not being able to run ads. And a lot of the times it just felt like more of a bit of a two-person race, as you can see on the airwaves in both the debate.
Just a real quick correction. John Larson is not in line for the Ways and Means chairmanship. He is in line to recover the position he had as the chair of the Social Security Subcommittee.
Sorry. I'm trying to. I believe. I thought he said that he was going to chair. But
it's part. It's part of Ways and Means. That's the But in any event,
really quickly, what other primary should we watch for in Connecticut?
The General Assembly. There are 8 Democratic and 3 Republican. There's an oddity in one that there's a Republican candidate who's been repudiated by his party for homophobic statements, Jaden McCormick in Eastern Connecticut. We have a generational thing in New Haven. Patty Dillon, who would be the longest serving member of the House, she's facing a challenge from somebody in their 20s and somebody else who just turned, I think, 31.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. You got to listen back next week as well. You got to listen to the show next week, as we are going to have candidates from the first district here. Thank you to Chloe Wynn, Eric Austin, the rest of the team, and of course, Mark Pazniokis joining me today, Lisa Hagan. Thank you so much for watching the show. This is The Wheelhouse. Download it wherever you get your podcasts. Have a good week. We'll talk to you next week. We'll talk about the first district. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.